it's easy to grow complacent. I think that can happen for a number of reasons. I know one reason it happens is when pastors just sort of get comfortable with where they are. For some pastors, it's because they've maybe were able to acquire some level of popularity, and so they've developed some kind of celebrity status within the community that they serve, or even online or something like that. Now, I don't think I've been tempted with that too badly. The whole popularity or celebrity status kind of thing. Although I will say, once I was, in full-time ministry, it was nice when people started putting that REV, that Reverend, in front of my name, which is really kind of funny, because of all the people who should be modeling humility, someone somewhere decided to put a word that means someone who is to be adored or revered, decided to put that in front of our names. Maybe we do adore our leaders too much sometimes. I think we see that happen whenever a Christian leader does something stupid and nobody can believe it. It's like, how could so-and-so do such a thing? So-and-so embezzled money. So-and-so ran off with the organist. Surely so many could have turned a blind eye to all of the sexual abuse happening in the Catholic Church, because people just assumed that these priests were some sort of next level holy. And that's how you could get a situation where parents of the victims would validate the stories or the side of the priests and invalidate what their own children were telling them. Now, that's how big of a problem this is. Not just others deceiving, but our own self-deception, our own closed-mindedness when it comes to the pervasiveness of sin, and the assumption that we make that those we adore could surely never do such a thing. I did the same thing with a prominent Christian apologist and leader whose name is Ravi Zacharias. When allegations came out about him, I just assumed it was another case of those with that particular agenda trying to tarnish the reputation of one more Christian leader. But now, Ravi Zacharias' own ministry, RZIM, or Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, has come out saying this, that there's convincing and credible evidence that he, quote, engaged in sexual misconduct over the course of many years. Now, I think the final report is still forthcoming, but that's what his own ministry has already admitted. I adored Ravi. In many ways, he was a mentor to me. I know he didn't know me, but I listened to all of his stuff. I read his books. And so now I, like so many of us in this broken world in which we live, we have a choice. I have a choice here. Do I invalidate the words of truth that are coming from a very credible source, his own ministry in this case, make up my mind about what I want the truth to be, or do I yield to the truth and look for God to work regardless or despite human brokenness? Our passage today begins with the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. The Israelites did not recognize God working among them anymore, and the blame for that was largely left at the feet of a single man, Eli the priest. In fact, if you go back, look at the beginning of 1 Samuel, Eli even confuses Hannah's honest prayer for drunkenness. And in our passage today, we'll see he takes quite a bit of time figuring out what God is doing in Samuel. We'll also read about sort of the corruption of Eli's sons and how Eli just sort of let it happen. wasn't necessarily that Eli was doing anything evil, but he was letting the evil persist, which I think it was Edmund Burke who said, all that's necessary for evil to rule, or something to that effect, is for good men to do nothing. Just in many ways, Eli failed. And so begins this process of removing Eli from the prophetic office and the transfer of power to his understudy, Samuel. One person speaking of the passage today says, this new beginning with Samuel requires facing all that has failed, and this story does it without flinching or deceiving. So I invite us to read that together now. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel, and he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli, and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call you, lie down again. So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I didn't call, my son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and yet he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli finally perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay there until morning, then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. He said, Here I am. Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. There's a little bit of Jewish comedy going on here, because when you look at the word Eli, it means my God. So here's Samuel a number of times getting up and going to my God, Eli, but not really to his God, his true God. Maybe that's a testament of how Samuel could, put Eli up on a pedestal a little bit, maybe adored him too much. And surely Eli and Samuel are hesitant here. We know Samuel does not want to have to offer this hard word to Eli, and surely Eli knows that this isn't going to be the best news for him. But both Samuel and Eli become willing participants in God's will, in the removal of Eli's own family from the prophetic office, from power, and the transfer of that power to Samuel. So Eli yields, Samuel is available, and God resolves to do a new thing. So the thrust of the story is certainly not about Eli's ending, but about Samuel's start. It's about God speaking through the darkness, God working around and through the brokenness of humanity, working through a sin-sick people. And that's really the message, I believe, here for today. God is not limited to only being able to work in the holiest of people. God is bigger than that. God's ability to work is not dependent upon our ability to remain scandal-free or perfect. God's ability to work and bring about His will is not dependent upon us specifically, or our political party, or our denomination, or our style of worship, or our method of leadership, or our way of being the church. No, God will do whatever God needs to do to bring about His will, to maintain His vision and future. You might remember that Samuel was really a miracle baby. Hannah didn't think that she could become pregnant. So that far back, God is already working to replace Eli. God is already working it out. But here's the thing. We should be careful to bash Eli or adore Samuel. Because while Eli did fail in many ways, he was still able to yield to the truth, even when it wasn't what he wanted to hear. And while Samuel is prompt and sincere in the work of the Lord, as Calvin put it, Samuel's own sons will be no less scoundrels than Eli's. In fact, the people will one day pretty much tell Samuel exactly what they told Eli. You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king like other nations to govern us. In fact, if we look down through the history, you've got Eli, Eli's sons, Samuel's sons, and then everything that goes on with Saul and, frankly, even David. There's brokenness. There's human brokenness. But the point is, none of it stopped God. It might have shifted our focus. It might have distracted us. We might have got hung up on whatever this week's scandal was. But God's resolve to bring about His will is greater than our weakness and our failures. So maybe today is an opportunity to stop being so surprised when those we adore inevitably reveal their brokenness. After all, we know they're not perfect, as we are not perfect. Maybe some of you are being called to make yourself available, like Samuel. But maybe some of you are being called to yield, like Eli. And perhaps we all ought to trust God more, remembering that it's going to take a lot more than a little sin to disrupt God's plans. In fact, God has taken care of that one once and for all through His Son, Jesus Christ, who Scripture says came not because we were perfect, but came despite our sin. It was while we were yet sinners that Christ died for us. So while there are obviously qualifications and expectations for God's people and those who lead them, there's also forgiveness from a God whose mission and vision is not shaken by our faults and failures. God is always going to call forth new leaders. Christ is going to have His church one way or another. God's will is not dependent upon whether we specifically are obedient. There's always another Samuel, and if that Samuel fails, there's another Samuel after that. And that's not an excuse to fall short. It's simply an acknowledgement that God's will to love this world is greater than our will to obey Him, and that's okay to admit. In fact, it's a call to action, really, to be ready to be the next Samuel. Because perhaps God is calling us to take up the mantle, to pick up where things were left off, and to say those words. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Amen.